There was a paper published by a Bitcoin venture capital firm called Epoch. Talks about how banking can be different in the future using Bitcoin. I enjoyed reading this paper. It was a couple of reasons why I think it's important. First off, this is very well written. If you are looking for an institutional level adoption of Bitcoin dissection, these guys do a fantastic job. It's very well cited. The paper is very well written and talks about the interior workings of the banking system in a way that I don't think many people have had a chance to take a look at. So if you're interested how Bitcoin might fit into the overall infrastructure and how it looks, definitely want to check this out. But I wanted to have a broader conversation about the banking system and whether these guys are even on the right track with using Bitcoin. Lucas, you are a scholar of financial policy, monetary systems. I thought you'd have some really great insight into this. What's your first take on this? Are they barking up the right tree? Are they putting Bitcoin at the right spot? And is this the future of banking?
Overall, this paper imagines Bitcoin as being held as a reserve by central banks. And if you think about how our financial system is set up today, we have central banks or private banks that have been given a monopoly to act as a central bank, and they have created institutions like the Bank of International Settlements in order to figure out what they owe to each other, so that global trade can commence. So what they imagine is that in lieu of a former silver standard or a gold standard or the dollar standard or a petrol oil standard, that Bitcoin is going to be held by the various reserve banks of the world. And I would say if the system is, well, I would say that is likely to be what happens in the future of Bitcoin. So so on one hand, yes. But on another hand, I begin to question the relationship of central banks with the commercial or private banks that exist in the world. And I think this gets very interesting whenever we think about the political control that exerted over central banks and how they have relied on growing debt growing debt passed on to the taxpayers of their various countries, and whether that system is sustainable. And I think that's a broader question that is going on in in the world of money, in the world of economics, and finance, and it's something that Trump is fighting to change. So I'm one. I do agree that it's sophisticated and that it really lays out how Bitcoin is likely to be used if the system stays the same.
So the thing that I lasered in on to start with was in an early part of the paper, which is how does the interchange between banks function? It talks about FedWire, talks about how we actually do bank to bank transfers, and some people routinely experience this because they've done a wire transfer. They contemplate that Bitcoin acts as a neutral party where banks of different types throughout the entire world could potentially be interacting at a settlement layer instead of being bound to a politically captured Fedwire system, which is controlled by the US government and famously was used against Russia and the Russian oligarchs to seize their wealth. So you do not have a neutral Switzerland style interchange system between the banks. You have something that is largely in the control of the United States. And if there is a desire globally to be on a exchange system that's neutral and that nobody controls, and I want to talk about the nobody controls bit, see where that goes. But if Bitcoin can act as that neutral party, you might see BRICS, the Federal Reserve System, and a host of other type of banking systems using Bitcoin as this neutral settlement layer. And if they are going to use that neutral settlement layer, it would seem natural that either they'd be using the Bitcoin L1 token or some other type of thing that is represented on that chain. That could be some sort of a central bank token system that exists that just piggybacks on top of the best database that's ever been created. That's a very real possibility. I don't know that it necessarily has to be Bitcoin, but I think it likely that they would use that given the limited supply and the things that we've talked about, where you have a currency that is provably secure and has a limited supply. It seems like a good thing to use as a reserve asset.
You know, I do think that BRICS is already creating blockchains for their payment channels, but I don't think that they're going to be interested in Bitcoin. And this is where I begin to.
Well, hold on a minute. When we say that they're using blockchains, I mean it's possible to use other technology, but the security of those blockchains, if they're permissioned and they're used as an internal ledger, it's just a consequence of a technology that might be interesting, but it's not something that would be interesting to the global public, any more interesting than a bank using some particular database to back something. Like that is not, it's not revolutionary because it is still very centrally controlled. So it doesn't really matter that it exists because it's no longer auditable. It's no longer has those properties that make it very interesting to the world, like the way that Bitcoin is interesting in its globally permissionless, auditable, provably fair, and has this massive security budget backing it.
Well, but Bitcoin has also worked in aspects that are not going to be that palatable to a group of central banks. The ability to enter and exit into the Bitcoin system, for anyone to be operating a node, they're not necessarily going to be interested in that. I think what they would.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. Why do nodes entering and exiting the Bitcoin system make any difference if the entire system operates in a globally secure fashion? Like, why would that matter?
Because they don't. Because one, they don't need it, and two, they're going to operate more like a club that's establishing their rules and are going to be more interested in something that looks like a proof of stake or proof of authority, because they have known entities that they're going to be allowing into something like the BRICS system, and there are, there's a broader political conversation that goes on as to whether they want them to stay, whether they don't. So they'll.
Well, hold on. That right there is what makes Bitcoin interesting for this piece. I would say that is the same reason why a lot of people are not interested in Fed right now. Because Fed has all those same properties. It's permissioned, it only allows certain participants, and it's controlled by a certain set of players, and then you can be excluded. So to the extent that there is a desire to not have that sort of control at the foundational layer, that's where Bitcoin will rise or fall. That's my supposition here, because if BRICS does that, if they do it that way, it's no different than Fed. And if you fall on the wrong side of whatever the controllers of BRICS think, then you're still on the wrong side of history and your wealth can be seized.
Okay, the FedWire is for passing money around the reserve banks of the United States. SWIFT is the international payment system. So they've been fighting SWIFT for quite some time. And you mentioned the United States turning the channel of transmitting money against Russia. They've been doing so to other countries for 20 or 30 years. Switzerland really comes to mind in 2014.
Right. I'm not missing the nuance here. I'm trying to point out that Bitcoin acting as a neutral third party where you can't do this kind of stuff is what makes it interesting. Now, if you say BRICS is just going to reinvent the same old wheel that we've had before, I think that there may be less interest in that moving forward.
Well, but it's not going to be. It's not the same old wheel, because the dollar, the Bretton Woods system, the dollar system with its institutions in the IMF and the World Bank was created and gave a great deal of power to the United States, and also set up proxies like Great Britain and Japan to further ensure the cabal and the control of the United States of that system. And so when they're thinking about the next system, they're not as revolutionary as to say, well, we want to be able to enter and exit this system automatically. What they're looking at is saying we'd like something that looks like the Bretton Woods dollar system, that looks like the Bancor, but it gives all of the participating countries an equal measure of participation, or equal which does not is not in the control of any one country. Now, you mentioned earlier that the security of Bitcoin is an issue, and I think that that actually is something that central banks are going to be more concerned about, because we've mentioned in the past on the show the voting or the mining pools of Bitcoin, and also the corporate mining companies of Bitcoin. And so if you're a small country without a large amount of cheap electricity, then you're going to be looking at Bitcoin as something that looks something more like the former United States dollar system, because there is no equality of the input or the ability to participate in the security mechanism of Bitcoin. That is privileged towards more developed countries that have more electrical production, and also the access to sophisticated technical equipment. So I don't know that that's going to be appetizing to the majority of small countries that exist in the world.
Well, I'm still lasering in on the politically neutral one, and it's this part in the paper where they discuss it. It says Bitcoin offers the same settlement finality as these interchange systems. I wouldn't laser in so much on Fedwire. I'd include Swift and Fed in the same kind of a discussion. But that it operates in a globally accessible, politically neutral network. Like the security of Bitcoin, like we can talk about that, whether that's going to remain in place. I think that there are minor changes to the Bitcoin protocol that could easily remedy this problem. It's not hard, and it's not something that I think would be politically unacceptable to the community of Bitcoin. It's like this system has changed in the past. It can change in the future. I think anybody that looks at Bitcoin as something stagnant is not thinking about it correctly. So if there are problems that exist, as soon as they become big enough problems, or they're decided to be big enough problems by the community, it will adjust, and it will become something new, and it will address those issues. And that there are at least two things that I could think of that could potentially force a change to Bitcoin, and it would be relatively accepted. That would be if we had some sort of a quantum breaking event that damaged or sufficiently compromised SHA-256, or if we ended up where there was a security problem with respect to a 51% attack and some kind of a collusion attack, and that could be mitigated. And both of those problems are solvable given the designs and technology that we have today. So I think it's disingenuous to look at Bitcoin as it is today and say that it has an issue and that issue is never resolvable. Like that's just not how software systems work.
Well, I think what they would be looking for as an ideal change would be for the consensus on what are the accepted and immutable transactions that are recorded would be done by those who are actually holding Bitcoin, and for that to be levied for the system to work. But that's not how Bitcoin was created. It gives the consensus control to those who are mining and supporting the network. And
it's not necessary. I know that there's been a lot of focus on the 21 million Bitcoin. I think a small amount of inflation in Bitcoin wouldn't harm Bitcoin at all. Not a bit. So
well,
that's like another super palatable change. It's not.
I'm like to agree, but to go back to the white paper of Bitcoin, it was created to be a cash system, not a reserve asset system. And so,
whether the original vision of something is intact or not doesn't really inform on where it is today, or even where it can go. Like things have their historical roots. It's it was never designed as a cash system because it could never scale to cash. And it was known that it couldn't scale to cash.
Oh, well, it's in the title of the paper. And I think this also goes to the consensus security being assigned to the miners rather than to the holders of Bitcoin.
That is, you're putting us back into like a fundamental discussion about whether Bitcoin should remain a proof of work technology and whether that's an innovation or not. That we've had extensive discussions about this. I'm not sure that the holders of
that's not the discussion we're having. I'm saying that the central banks of the world are going to be looking at it in that angle, and I don't think that they are going to be. I don't think that they are going to be generally positive or to think it possible for Bitcoin to change. They might think there could be programmability, that a consensus is reached to add programmability to the change with something like the Great Script Restoration or with anarchy. But I don't think that they would ever envision one, a change as drastic as adding tailing emissions to it or increasing the supply of Bitcoin beyond 21% or 21 million, nor would they ever expect a change to be made as to the decision as to what information is recorded to be moved to the holders of the coin rather than the miners of Bitcoin. And those, I think, are going to be, they'll look at Bitcoin and say, well, let's take some of the ideas here and let's make a public immutable blockchain in which we share in the consensus, something that looks a little bit more like the IMF and the special voting rights of the IMF, that puts the voting in on who is adding into the liquidity pool, so
that's a new coin. That is an entirely new coin. It's not Bitcoin. So we can say that like these roots of what has been planted with the seed of Bitcoin are going to grow into some other tree, but it's not Bitcoin then. So I don't know. Like, I'm not saying that Bitcoin is not the future of banking, but that it is going to be relegated to the dustbin of history.
Well, let's talk about another tension that exists between central banks and commercial banks. If you could scroll back up to the tiers of the banking systems. Tucker Carlson had that one right there. So we see here tier 1 central banks, tier 2 commercial banks. And the accepted notion of economists, the prevailing narrative in the world, is that banks hold reserves. The central banks usually actually hold those physical reserves. They used to be something that looked like gold or silver. Now those are treasuries that the government issues that they promise they're going to pay back later with God knows what. Tucker Carlson recently had Richard Werner, who is an economist who lived in Japan when Japan faced a massive amount of stagflation back in the early 90s. And he began to look at the system differently and said, oh, it's not that the central banks are on top of the system. The commercial banks are on top of the system. And they've created a narrative about central banks who are going out and measuring gross domestic product so the commercial banks can extract the most amount of money from a taxed population as possible, most amount of money that can sustain. And that is a very niche understanding of how the world monetary system works. But Donald Trump is operating under an understanding that is closer to reality than the more broadly accepted notion that central banks are at the top of that system. And they're
well, wait, go back to that for a second. Now, this bears repeating here. So you're saying the central banks are not at the top. There's something above this.
Yes, and if you think about
what exists above the tier 1, just say it one more time, because I feel like this is a very important point to to drive home is that you're saying this diagram is fundamentally wrong, and that there are political movements that are happening right now within the United States that seeks to make a change to that there is a tier zero.
So what? Well, I often mention that it's that if we constrain ourselves to discussing politics, and putting the the elected officials at the top of politics, that we are going to be frustrated in our predictions and expectations of what the future looks like, and that's because um, there is a shared way of looking at the world that we probably best describe as colonial imperialism, that spans the life of many countries that participated in it in various levels, and that serve interests of groups that stretch and span any of those nation states.
And the colonial system that we're talking about is something like the fact that Canada is still a protectorate of Great Britain, and that Greenland is still a protectorate of Denmark. This is the roots of the colonial system that still exists in our modern day.
And we can also think about it in, Texas used to be a republic that 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 had its own revolution to separate it away from Spain. But when it was subsumed by the United States, the debts of Texas were subsumed by the United States. And the United States, likewise, whenever we fought a revolutionary war against England, the United States received considerable, financial inputs from France, which was a colonial empire of itself. And so, if you start thinking about this in terms of finance and of money lenders that span countries and go around and pay for revolutions in various countries in the world, the debts last after the last shot is fired in a revolution, and with those debts come political pressure to make policies that secure the payment of those debts into the future, and this has become sort of the broad empire, the financial empire system of the world that we live in today. And so, if we're going to break that grand financial oligarchy, that's if we talk about this so much, but we don't think about it necessarily in terms of how the banking system plays into it. But when we talk about the financial oligarchies of Europe, or the discussions in Ukraine about who gets to monetize the assets of Ukraine in the future, who got the spoils of the war after World War I and World War II, the Crimean War, and even let's say Syria in the middle, and Syria and Iran in the Middle East. That's, if we're to understand the broader political narrative, we need to understand that these debt obligations last beyond the wars. And so I think Richard Werner is very has a lot of insight into what is truly going on here whenever he says that these narratives that we've had about gross domestic product and central banks have actually been established by private banking interests that financed revolutions and then turned around and said, you owe us these debts and you need to pay them off. And so, if that's the case of what reality actually looks like, Bitcoin being held by the central banks, those central banks are going to, I should say, politicians who are looking to break that system are going to say, if Bitcoin can be held by the commercial banks, or worse, if Bitcoin can be controlled at the consensus level by going in and controlling the mining, then we still have a problem of being controlled by the colonial empire monetary system.
And I'm gonna keep challenging this. I don't think that this is an a priori for Bitcoin, and I don't think it's the way that it has to be in the future. I think that this is going to be something that will be solved with a minor change to the protocol. I don't think it's a thing to point to and say because of this minor aspect of Bitcoin that it cannot move forward. And Bitcoin was not created as a tool of a political movement. It was the creation of a small group of individuals who wanted to change how things were being done and invent a new technology that could enable certain types of political persuasions that they had. But it wasn't like this was created by a group that wanted to do it. It almost seems like it's a Johnny come lately glom onto Bitcoin, making Bitcoin into something that they want to use as a tool to further other aims. But Bitcoin, the protocol, Bitcoin as the system, I don't think it cares if people try to do that. It just exists, and it's starting to be integrated into the fabric of companies and individuals that exist outside of these systems. And to the extent that it continues to be an exchange of value on a permissionless ledger, it has relevance outside of whether it becomes adopted by central banks or not. I think it's an interesting thing to think about if central banks will actually adopt it as a settlement layer. And I think that it's very likely that it's to be held as an asset that would be done that way because of its political neutrality.
So again, I mean, I agree with you. I think that the design and the creation of Bitcoin was bona fide, in that a group of people who wanted to break the system, to get out of the debt slavery, the debt obligation of the current financial system, were looking for an alternative. But I worry that that the United States, or parts of the monetary system that understood the threat of it very early, have done everything that they could to try to change Bitcoin from a cash to a financial asset, and in doing so want to either capture it, just as this paper imagines it, by the central banks. And if the commercial banks like give up on that and say, oh, the Bitcoin is going to be held by the central banks of the world, if it's just a holding asset by those central banks, and they still are controlling the expectation of the debts that all of these countries in the world owe to the private banking system, then Bitcoin also begins to work against this notion of liberty and freedom that the original founders intended. And to that, I would say there's an economist that is also a pariah in the world of economists named Michael Hudson. And Michael Hudson was at the I believe he worked for the bank for the international settlements desk of Chase Manhattan back in the 70s, maybe even as early as the 60s. He's almost 90 years old. He's brilliant. Michael Hudson says that the problem with this system, and mind you, his books are read by the CIA for a truer understanding of the financial system. And so when you get into government and people say, oh, how do we want to take advantage of the various countries in the world, the State Department and the other members of the blob read Michael Hudson and understand the predatory nature of the banking system and how they can use the institutions that the United States has set up to extract as much money from the likes of Chile and Argentina and countries in Africa and countries in Asia. But Michael Hudson says that the very base of this problem is actually figuring out who decides about the forgiveness of debt. And so when I think also about Bitcoin being immutable, being a machine that operates outside of political considerations, I worry as to how forgiveness of debts works into this system to break the private commercial banking interests, continued colonization, and extraction of the various countries of the world. I don't know if you want to comment on that, but there's also something else that I think we need to understand whenever we're talking about what's at stake as this current system is coming into political question. And Donald Trump has been has been taking a different path, as well we know, um, than the majority of economists would suggest. And even Michael Hudson, is shaking his head. But Donald Trump has been explicit that he does not believe in free trade, and free trade is the engine under which this current system operates. And he wants to move to a world of fair trade, um, and fair trade being uh, specific tariffs levied on the various countries of the world, and getting away from this notion that um, the commercial interests of the world supersede those of the political interest of the world. If he wins out with that argument and establishes a fair trade system of the world, I actually think that Bitcoin could end up uh, being the reserve that is held by the various central banks of the world. But I believe that future is contingent on whether Trump and other nations of the world, including the BRICS, are able to come together and to break the control of the commercial banking system of the central banks of the world. So that's, I guess, in the
Are,
at the
are we are we are we seeing the evidences of that with the current dust up that's happening at the Federal Reserve with the governor who just was fired by Trump? Is that where we're seeing some of the first shots fired here,
I
along
mean,
with the tariffs that have been put in place?
first shots fired, I would say, were Donald Trump turning to the banks and telling them to take physical custody of gold, and then the executive order that he
Did
signed.
they take physical custody of gold? Did they do what he told them
Yeah,
to do?
absolutely. That's why the London Gold Exchange has been patas arribas in absolute pandemonium for several months and been unable to deliver on the gold promises. So, and that was before he took office. We don't know what actually occurred there, but we do know that the banks of New York, the large banks in the United States, who had paper gold held in the London Exchange, took physical custody of that gold and had it moved to the COMEX in New York. And the gold bugs of Twitter um, were going crazy about this. We also know that Donald Trump has had this narrative about the golden era that he was very explicit in establishing the rhetoric for as he took office. And then he signs an executive order that says that he's going to use the emergency powers of government, which is only gives him a 90-day window to do this, but he's going to use those emergency powers to establish tariffs to make trade fair and reciprocal. And that's not free. And now we see him attacking. And again, the Federal Reserve is not a central bank. It is a private bank that has been given a monopoly charter. And so when he tries to find grounds to remove the director of the Federal Reserve and so directors of reserve banks, that is him trying to force the narrative to make people say, well, wait a second. Um, is the problem central banking, or is the problem having private banks in the role of a public bank? And so then we also see him see him taking what, a 10% share of Intel, and those libertarians and fiscal monetary conservatives who have not questioned the relationship of the banking system as to whether it's actually public or whether it's private, in a mask of disguise acting as a public bank, are also scratching their heads as they look at Trump and say, wait a second, I thought you were a Republican, and here you are, you're 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 putting the private sector under the control of the government.
Well, I mean, okay, hold on. This has been done before. This is what happened with General Motors. General Motors had a stake that was taken by a government position in a bailout situation. Is that Why is that any different than what's happening now? Because it
Well,
happened to the Republican?
because this one's not about a bailout. This one is about returning manufacturing to the United States.
I mean, you call it potato, I call it potato. I see it as a bailout. Like what Intel is going down in flames. Like this company has not been innovative in a long time. It has been largely lambasted for missing out on one of the greatest chip movements of all time, which was moving towards GPUs. I mean, Intel kind of sat on their ass and didn't do anything. They didn't innovate. They became a company which largely should have gone out of business. And here we have the US government jumping in, swooping in to save an American company that failed to do what it should have been doing. I mean, there's no reason why Intel needed to cede all this ground. It didn't have to lose Apple as a customer. I mean, all the things that it's done over the last 20 years just been running itself into the ground.
Well, so the bailouts in 2009 that were centered one around housing, but also around the auto industry. The auto industry bailouts were about quelling anxiety about jobs in America. And the Intel narrative is actually about bringing over chip production in America, and this is something Democrats and Republicans agree on. And this is also an eye towards that alternative future.
I mean, we have chip production facility. It just went online in Arizona. Yeah, you just put one of the biggest chip production facilities in the U.S. and it's open for business and running and operating.
But the chip production is the CHIPS Act was not enough to put us.
I didn't say CHIPS Act. I just said we have chips being produced in the United States, and a big plant that just opened up.
And I'm saying it's going to take continued government support to get that industry up and running, because it's more complicated than building a building in Arizona and putting enough electrical production next to that building. And
I'm not. Wait, hold on. It's not just a building. This is a fully operational facility producing chips. And the reason it was located next to where it is in Arizona is because there was a nuke plant sitting right there. So they have an unbelievable amount of electricity that is being generated at rock bottom prices to help operate that facility. And that was pre-existing. So all that infrastructure kind of came together, and it didn't just come together in a short period of time. This has been boiling for almost a decade now, and it's open. Like this is not a small thing, and they're going to expand production from that facility.
You can build the building and you can put the energy next to the building, but you still have to have people that have a level of craftsmanship and skill to make these chips. You have to have an institutional knowledge that exists amongst the minds of people who the world turns to more, robotic manufacture, but at some level you still need skilled workers, and this is where the United States has not been able to compete with China in that regards. So you also see Donald Trump pivoting from his nationalist tendencies and saying, oh, wait a second, we're not just going to continue to allow Chinese visas for academic visas for students to come over and study in the United States. We're going to double it from 300,000 to 600,000. Again, to the gnashing of teeth by the Maha MAGA nationalist crowd. But my take on that was, if Donald Trump really wanted to bring the United States more further along in bringing back manufacturing of a litany of products into the United States, then we should have had a quid pro quo that said American workers can go to China and can begin to see the operational complexity and the skill of the workers there, and then ostensibly bring that back to the United States to give us a 30-year leg up on where we have been, where our skills have been dwindling from offshoring production for the last 30-40 years.
Well, it's an interesting place to end. I'm not sure a way that we got there from Bitcoin banking, but I see the path towards we started with talking about how Bitcoin could potentially be integrated into the banking system at the various levels. Had a good discussion about the political underpinnings of how banking works and where we're seeing the Trump administration take some of their political movement. I'm interested to explore this topic of whether some of the things that are being done with Intel actually result in more manufacturing in the United States, but probably a completely new topic. And I think we should cover that in its own show. So definitely interested in the subject, but I think we're out of time, and we'll see you next time on FOMO.